When I checked out Apple's M1 Mac Mini at the start of the year, I was incredibly impressed with the performance, and more so, the performance per watt. That thing was drawing under 30 watts from the wall, under full load. Most desktop systems can't even idle that low, so seeing that much performance with such little power is exceptional. The catch to the standard M1 was its rather low power design with 4 low power efficiency cores and 4 high power, high performance cores, so it wasn't exactly designed to be a complete powerhouse. But now? Well, now we have this, the M1 Pro and M1 Max, and it's frankly insane. Apple launched 5 versions of the new M1, an 8-core with 6 performance and 2 efficiency cores in the CPU and a 14-core GPU, a 10-core with 8 performance cores and still 2 efficiency with a 14-core GPU, a 10-core with 16 GPU cores, a 10-core Max with double the number of RAM chips and therefore double the memory bandwidth, and 24 GPU cores, and a 10-core Max with 32 GPU cores. Complicated, I know, and what's worse is that the 8 and 10-core variants with the 14-core GPUs, those are only available on the 14-inch Mac Pro, not this 16-inch model. And if you buy the M1 Max, you need a minimum of 32 gigabytes of RAM, although can spec that up to 64 gigs. But if you get the M1 Pro like I have here, well, that starts at 16 and tops out at 32. Yeah, there's a lot of options to pick from there. Of course, Apple isn't alone in having a wall of options. Speccing a new Dell XPS 15 greets you with a similar wall of options, but it's kind of, well, slightly more unusual for someone like Apple to give, well, that much choice. What I have here then is the 16-inch with the M1 Pro, so 10-core and 16-core GPU, with 16 gigabytes of unified memory, meaning that both the CPU and GPU make use of that RAM, just like most mobile chips with integrated graphics. And this also has the 1 terabyte SSD. This will set you back a cool £2,600, but of course you do get a rather shiny new display. A 3456 by 2234, basically a stunning display. It has ProMotion, so 120 Hz, has a mini LED backlight with up to 1600 nits of peak brightness with HDR content, and of course you get a sleek new body to go with it. Sticking with the performance though, compared to literally any other Windows machine I have tested, it's easily one of, if not the fastest I've had my hands on. Seriously, in Cinebench R23, its single core performance is right up there, with everything else actually tying with Intel's most recent 11th gen mobile chips and beating anything AMD has, at least right now. That's already impressive, but the multi-core is the real standout. It's right at the top of the field, only just behind the 11900H, which holds around a 13% lead, and a couple of the 5th gen Ryzen 8 cores, again most of which of those are only 2 or 3% faster, except for the max power version of the 5900X, which it was in the Zephyrus Duo and that was insane, but that runs about 15% faster. Now, that performance is already pretty decent, but what you might be, well, you might be a little surprised why I'm so impressed by this. I mean, a 10-core, 8 performance cores, but a 10-core CPU is getting technically outperformed by 8-core chips from both Intel and AMD, so what's so special? Well, that would be the power drop. Now, unfortunately, I don't have CPU package power figures for this. We could only measure the sort of total system power, and whereas all of my other measurements that I will show are the package power for the CPU itself. But still, with that said, this thing peaked, as in the maximum we recorded it running at any point during our tests was 53 watts, as in 53 watts for everything. For the display, for running the fans, not that they generally turn on, running the motherboard and SSD, the RAM, everything in this system draws just 53 watts under full load, and that is absolutely incredible. We actually did a bit of a test with changing the brightness on the display, and we figure that the display itself is probably accounting for anywhere between 5 and 10 watts of that, and the GPU is also probably taking a good couple of those. So yeah, this is clearly the best performance per watt chip I've ever tested. Carrying on to Blender, this was actually rather interesting. In the BMW render, it sits as one of the fastest chips out there, beating almost anything Team Red or Blue can throw at it. All with, again, between half and a quarter of the power. But in the Gooseberry scene, one that takes almost 20 minutes on these sorts of laptops, well, that's actually a fair bit down the list. Now, to make it clear, it still offers exceptional performance and is still between half and a quarter of the power draw of any of those other chips, but it does slip by comparison, at least slightly. I'm not entirely sure why, in fact. It does run fairly hot. It peaked at 90 degrees Celsius in our testing, but that's actually pretty clearly by choice, as the fans refuse to spin up for pretty much anything under around 85 degrees, and when they do turn on, they do their best to, well, do as little as possible and be as quiet as possible as well, so I'm not entirely sure why that's the case. In Premiere Pro, using the latest version of the Puget Bench suite, the M1 Pro sits firmly on its own. Like, it's literally the fastest thing I've ever tested. It's faster than the Xeon W RTX Quadro-based Asus ProArt StudioBook Pro. Yes, it literally has Pro in the name twice, which I can only assume at this point costs somewhere between £5,000 and £10,000. Even the 11900K can't quite keep up with this machine, which is incredible. And this is Premiere. If you work in Final Cut instead, this is obvious that it has no competition, even comparison to the last gen MacBook as well. Interestingly though, in After Effects, possibly thanks to a lack of system memory, the Puget Bench score is rather low at 663 points, whereas most other machines I've tested got at least 800, and some of the higher ones are pushing more like 1200 points. I would expect that the 32GB model of this would offer much better performance, potentially chart-topping performance here too. When it comes to gaming, sadly our options are pretty limited. We tried everything we could, including GTA 5, both through Steam and the Heroic launcher. We tried CSGO and a bunch more titles with no real success. We did get 2 games running though. Rocket League through Steam, meaning that thanks to Epic Games we have no access to the online services, which is fantastic, and we got Shadow of the Tomb Raider running as well. Now, Rocket League did play on local mode, and even on the highest quality settings, played flawlessly at 1080p. We did have to hook up to an external 16:9 display to get it to run at 1080p rather than the more funky native 16:10 resolution, but it's perfectly playable even at a reduced 16:10, and it's easily over 60 FPS. With absolutely no fan noise, which is probably the more incredible bit. As for Tomb Raider, I had to buy a copy of that to run this test with, which means I don't have any existing results to compare to here, so I fired it up on an Asus ZenBook Pro Duo with an i9 10980HK and RTX 3070 laptop GPU. On the highest settings, or the highest presets, at 1080p, the MacBook managed 47 FPS average, whereas the ZenBook hits 78. What's interesting for me is looking at the little table the benchmark shows, which shows that the MacBook CPU is actually much more capable for gaming than the 10980HK. The CPU render average field, or the results for the i9, is 116 FPS, but on the M1 Pro it's 143. The bottleneck is even nicely laid out, showing that it's exclusively the GPU that is the bottleneck on the M1, but at 85% CPU bottleneck on the i9 machine. Looking at the GPU results, the M1 reports just over 50 FPS, whereas the 3070 reports 116. Of course, this is missing the vital piece of context, which is that not only is this not the most powerful GPU variant, in fact it's literally half the number of cores that the M1 Max 32-core GPU version has, but it's also an integrated GPU that's pulling, or according to Apple, it's using just 60 watts, or actually under 60 watts, versus the base 90 watt TDP of that 3070, which can actually boost all the way up to 110 watts using dynamic boost. Rather obviously, this isn't a gaming machine. But honestly, I would say that with a few more optimizations, I think this has the raw horsepower to actually be a fairly capable machine, and especially on that M1 Max, I think you'd have a pretty decent type. Again, I would probably go with at least 32 gigabytes for the system memory, thanks to the GPU sharing that memory, but again, it's still not bad. And what's more impressive than anything was the distinct lack of fan noise. Most gaming machines, even that ZenBook, start sounding like a jet taking off the second you fire up a game or do anything that's even remotely, CPU intensive. But on this, sure, the fans might technically be on, but, well, I never heard them at any point in my testing because they are running so quietly that they're well below the noise floor of the rooms that I'm in. For content creation or development, especially in an office space, almost all other machines are going to be somewhat of a nuisance in the office, but this isn't. Of course, that sort of content creation workflow is really the target market for these machines. I mean, they stuck a 1600 nits, 250 plus pixel per inch display on this thing that covers, well, actually exactly 100% of the DCI-P3 spectrum, which we verified, and it has multiple different profiles that you can pick from. It also has a 500 nit SDR brightness when you disable True Tone and Adaptive Brightness. And honestly, just looking at it, playing HDR content, it's absolutely stunning. Now, I do think that an OLED has the slight edge in just utter sheer beauty, but for HDR content especially, thanks to this having the 1600 nits XDR, as Apple calls it, mode, and the mini LED backlight that Apple says has thousands of local dimming zones, and actually that's kind of fairly accurate for what we've seen, this is a very nice experience. Sure, an OLED will have better overall control, especially because you can control every individual pixel, but again, in the grand scheme of things, this is so stunning to look at and such a nice experience to use that I can't say that I would mind. Honestly, I think this is one of the best panels on a laptop that I've seen, pretty much full stop, although there is actually a catch, and that is the response times. Now, sadly, I haven't ported my fancy new response time tool to macOS just yet, so I can't use that, but I'll be honest and say that I don't really need to because my 1000 FPS camera illustrates the issue perfectly fine. This is the UFO test. Here's what it's meant to look like. In fact, here's what it looks like on a 4K 60Hz OLED laptop display. And now here's what it looks like on this Mac Pro. Beyond the rather interesting pattern, it's actually kind of pretty slow. If you look at a full transition, besides the interesting pattern that gets displayed, if you pick the center pixel of the display and count how many frames it takes for that pixel to go from pure black to full white, you'll realize that that's about 30 milliseconds. Now, I know what you're thinking, this isn't a gaming machine, so who cares how fast the response time is? Well, beyond the fact that any amount of fast motion, like scrolling through web pages, especially the sort of light text, dark background type ones, is going to be relatively sort of blurry with fast motion. Actually having those sorts of rather dreadful results actually affects the content creation experience too. A 30 millisecond response time means that anything over 30 FPS, like say 35 or 38, 48, 60 FPS footage, all of those are going to have ghosted frames on screen during playback. Now luckily I can't say that this ended up being overly distracting or noticeable during my admittedly brief testing with this machine. And it's something that, the sort of good news here is that this is something that Apple could push as a fix, as a software update by just adding a touch of overdrive to help the pixels respond a little faster, especially since this is a ProMotion 120Hz display, and there's no way you're going to be using 120Hz as a genuinely smooth and responsive experience with that level of response time. One thing content creators will rejoice seeing on this machine is the I/O. You get ports now. I know it's incredible that a $1 trillion company removing basic necessities for an entire generation of machines only to give them back can be seen as some generous gift and not just a blatant cash grab and overly zealous control of their adoring fan base. I know I'm a bit biased, actually very, but hey, we've had full USB Type-A ports, Thunderbolt, HDMI and SD card readers this whole time without any dongles. Anyway, you get 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, which operate at 40 gigabits per second, actually through independent hubs, although I'm not sure how the bandwidth is actually divided between them. You do also get HDMI, but it's HDMI 2.0, meaning that you can do up to 4K 60 rather than say 4K 120 or 8K 60 from HDMI 2.1. You also get an SDXC card reader 2.0, not the newest 3.0 like you'll find on the newest creator-focused Windows machines, and you get the MagSafe 3 connector, which is for the included 140 watt USB-C power adapter. That power adapter, by the way, if you get the 14-inch base model, is only a 67 watt brick, and you have to pay extra for the 96 watt brick if you want fast charging. It's also worth noting that you can charge the machine via USB Type-C or the Thunderbolt ports, but you can only fast charge through the MagSafe connector, which does terminate in a USB-C plug, meaning that it is removable from the brick and in theory could be connected to other power sources if you need to. Speaking of MagSafe 3, it's actually really strong now. Like, if you pull straight outwards, perpendicular to the ports, you'll struggle to remove it, and you'll actually be more likely to have the machine move with you rather than the connector break off. You do sort of need to I guess, twist or snap it off, lifting from the back up and down to actually get it free. While that motion will become sort of muscle memory for if you spend any amount of time with this machine, it is a little bit of a shame that if you do, trip over the cable, it's more likely that the machine's going to go flying rather than the connector unclipping like the previous generations of MacBook with MagSafe generally would. But still, it's nice and makes a very satisfying snap. So has any or all of this convinced me, a fairly steadfast Windows user, that it's time to use a MacBook? Well, as much as the owner of this machine would probably want that answer to be yes, I'm afraid it's just not quite for me. Really, I'm not the target market for this machine anyway. That's more for creators and developers, especially those who are on the go or working in an actual office rather than me making videos in my spare bedroom. Unfortunately, you'll either have to be rather well off to afford one, or more likely have your company buy it for you, as these things are far from cheap. This 16-inch, 16GB of RAM, 1TB SSD, 10-core Pro CPU with the 16-core GPU, this, like I said, will set you back a cool £2,600. And if you want the full fat M1 Max with, or the M1 Max Mac, there you go, got the joke in, with 32 gigabytes of RAM and the same 1 terabyte SSD, you'll be parting ways with £3,300. Oh, and if you want to upgrade your SSD, remember that both the RAM and SSD are both soldered to the motherboard, meaning whatever you buy now is what you have for the life of the machine. Well, if you want that 2 terabyte SSD, that costs a staggering £400 on top of the £200 upgrade for the 1 terabyte drive, which is already on top of whatever they're costing the base 512 gig drive at. If you want a 4 terabyte SSD, well, that'll be a full grand instead. RAM is also a pain. If you get the M1 Pro, going from 16 gigabytes of RAM to 32 gig is £400, then it's only another 400 for the 64 gig model, although bear in mind you'll have to spend the extra 200 or 300 to upgrade to the M1 Max Mac rather than the M1 Pro Mac. Just to put all of that in comparison, Dell's XPS 15 with 32 gigabytes of RAM, 1 terabyte SSD, and the i7-11800H and RTX 3050 Ti, and actually the 3.5K OLED, all of that comes in at almost £300 less than this 16GB M1 Pro MacBook. And actually, there's a load of discounts live right now, which means that you can get the maxed out 11900H, 64 gigs of RAM, 2 terabyte SSD, and that 3.5K OLED for £100 less than this same 16 gig M1 Pro MacBook. That is one hell of an Apple tax. Of course, I know that plenty of people will happily pay that. And if that works for you, then fair play. I mean, if the frankly insane performance, the user experience, the ecosystem, or just that it's a status symbol appeal to you more than the price, things like response times, and the, well, anti-consumer practices, then that's perfectly fine. Unfortunately, that isn't me, so I'll happily hand this back to its owner and go back to my Windows desktop. There's also a lot of stuff that I haven't been able to cover for various reasons, and because this video is already incredibly long, so if you have any questions, I would love to hear them in the comments down below, and I'll do my best to get an answer for you. And I would also love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below as well. What do you think of this M1 Max Mac, or I suppose M1 Pro Mac? Also the M1 Pro and Max chips themselves versus the new chassis and the new sort of MacBook Pro model. I didn't mention the notch, but honestly, while it's easy to notice when you're looking at footage or you look at it for the first time, once you start using it, you actually stop noticing it, so I felt like it wasn't worth pointing out. And also one quick note is that the mini LED backlight zones, there's enough of them that when watching 16:9 content, it actually turns off those mini LEDs so that you actually get a fully black zone, which is pretty fantastic. And I can't say that I noticed all that much blooming either, so that's pretty good. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. I'll leave a link to probably Apple in the description if you do want to pick one up or check out the pricing. And that's kind of it. If you want to support my idiocy and these videos, then you can hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notification icon, or you can support me directly through things like the YouTube join button, where you get access to sponsor-free videos, our Money Men Discord chat, and some cool emojis to use in the comments and on our weekly live streams, or you can support on Patreon instead. There's also a load of other links in the description you can check out, affiliate links or places like Amazon, Overclock UK, or a load of other stuff. Feel free to take a look. I'll leave some more videos on the end cards, either some of the more recent laptop reviews like the Asus ProArt Pro StudioBook Pro, whatever it is, and maybe even the original M1 video if you're interested. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it, I'll see you on the next video.